Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. People oftentimes ask me, why do I criticize the Empire so much? To which I respond, how long did the Empire last? From 19 BBY to 4 or 5 ABY, depending on who you ask. That's only 23 to 24 years. A lot of you watching right now have successfully lived longer than the Empire. Congratulations. The Galactic Republic, on the other hand, lasted for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Even the New Republic managed to exist for 30 years, despite its, ill-advised policies. I mean, heck, the Build-A-Bear Workshop Empire just turned 26 years old, and now it's starting a cinematic universe with Sony Pictures, which means it will eventually become immortal. I mean, politics and warfare aside, the Empire was a flash in the pan of galactic history, and was inconsequential in a lot of ways. And it totally didn't need to be, if it just made one simple policy change. I mean, the gigantic triangle-shaped starships, the polished white uniforms and armor. Growing up, I, like every 10-year-old boy, loved playing soldier and galactic space marine. But of course, I'm not 10 years old anymore, and I realize that this is not a sustainable practice for a government. Of course, the Empire doesn't really care. I mean, most authoritarian states with a military-first policy are going to try to make military service as, positive as possible because they want people to join the military. This is why Imperial officers look sharp in their Hugo Boss-inspired uniforms with those shiny black jackboots. Sure, you're a logistics officer in a starship like 1,000 miles above the surface of a planet where you actually would need boots. Well, actually, jackboots are terrible against the elements. But then again, Imperial uniforms are really all about aesthetics. They're not really designed to be that functional, like a lot of things in the Empire. And there's a place and purpose for aesthetics, but generally speaking, it's wiser to make sure the foundation of your government, of your society, is solid. If you have enough security and enough liberty, then the majority of people can thrive and find happiness and therefore be more productive. The aesthetics of a healthy society will be naturally appealing and beautiful in ways that a state-controlled effort can never really match. And that's why most nations on Earth with a lot of soft power are typically better-run countries with freer societies. But here's the thing, the Galactic Empire could have lasted 100 years, maybe even a few thousand years with proper planning in place and a focus on things that actually promote a healthy society. Now, I, for personal and personality reasons, don't really like heavy centralized government control. I don't like the idea of government interfering with your everyday tasks, but I've definitely visited a lot of countries that might seem more authoritarian, and I've actually seen the benefits of those systems, begrudgingly. Some examples would be like Switzerland, Japan, and Singapore. And I kind of want to take a look at maybe how the Empire could learn from these systems. All three of these countries have quite idyllic societies, especially when you're looking in from the outside. These are three countries with relatively homogeneous cultures and demographics, something the Empire does not have simply because of the scale of the galaxy. But more importantly, these three countries have pretty heavily regulated societies, and they also have cultures that enjoy this type of more top-down approach in governance. Switzerland is one of the few direct democracies in the world, but its population, a mixture of ethnic French, German, and some Italians, all tend to voluntarily favor heavy regulations and control on even the smallest things in one's life. Singapore and Japan are also both technically democracies, but have only one ruling party. Both countries have strong governments and have a culture that is kind of repressive and conformist. Now, these are all extremely awesome places to visit because they're clean, they're safe, everything is well operated, and it's easy to get around. And you really can't argue with the high living standards and fascinating culture in these places that are really well preserved. Although, again, as a chaotic person, I imagine that living in these countries could be suffocating. But still, there's a reason why these countries are considered some of the best places to live in the world. The discipline and rule-based order in these countries maintain a stable society, and that is really the key to governance. Stability creates economic growth. It allows people to have families, to be happy, to start businesses, pursue whatever goals they want in life. And given how chaotic the world is, that's no small feat. I wouldn't say that this is the optimal way to run a society, but it's definitely a unique approach. The only way the Galactic Empire would have lasted long term is if it had modeled itself somewhat on one of these states. Rules and regulations, especially very overbearing and strict ones, really have to have a good reason if you are going to implement them. Singapore, for instance, has some of the harshest and most draconian anti-drug laws in the world, but they also don't have much of a drug culture or problem internally. So the idea here is to prevent such problems from rooting. At least that's what the government is thinking about. As a result, you're not actually seeing Singaporean families being broken apart by these drug laws like what was happening in America in the 1980s with our own war against drugs. Instead, the Singaporean drug laws mostly target stupid tourists and, drug smugglers. American drug laws are far more relaxed and, at least seem more moral than the Singaporean ones, but because they were poorly implemented, poorly thought out, they actually caused a massive amount of damage to our society. Whereas the harsh Singaporean laws could be considered immoral, the damage they create is far more limited and only affect individuals who have to resort to smuggling for these gangs in the first place. In this case, the harsher law that is well implemented and thought out is far superior than the nicer law, the more moral law that is not well implemented or thought out. Now, the Galactic Empire's crackdown on gang and pirate activity, especially in the core regions, helped win over the hearts of many of its citizens. Ray Sloan, Sienna Rhee, Iden Versio, three very capable Imperials, all benefited from the security apparatuses of the early Galactic Empire. But as we see in Andor, there was a shift in policy once rebel activity became more and more organized and effective. The Public Order Resentencing Directive was a heavy-handed reaction to the Aldhani Garrison payroll heist. It was reactive and featured collective punishment, which almost never works and instead causes more resentment and extremism. And this was a huge problem with the Empire. They were simply making the wrong type of regulations. If you're going to pass a law, you really got to think about whether this law is actually going to benefit your society or actually do more damage than it prevents. Also, never pass a law that you cannot enforce because that destroys trust in the institution. The Galactic Empire basically did all of these things wrong as it became a more militarized police state. It passed draconian laws that prevented economic growth and development, and at the same time, these laws drained imperial resources and just forced criminals to migrate to the Outer Rim, straight into the hands of the Rebel Alliance. And I think it should be noted that all three of these countries I referenced before have extremely well-developed infrastructures, terrific healthcare, and many advanced industries, along with high GDP per capita. And that's because the ruling party in these countries all focus a lot of their energy on economic development and improving the lives of its people rather than focusing on, territorial expansion and militarism. Take note, Palpatine and Wilhuff Tarkin. And if you take a look at the foreign policy of these three countries, they're all pretty similar. I mean, Switzerland is hilariously and immorally neutral in almost every conflict to its own benefit. Singapore is always neutral, playing the West and China against each other in order to survive. And Japan, while not exactly neutral in global affairs today, has bombarded its society with Hello Kitty in an attempt to demilitarize society, and until recently had been an unabashedly pacifist nation. Now, I typically am against warfare, unless it's a defensive war or a preemptive strike against, soulless Xenos. I truly believe if you're prioritizing your country and your people's well-being, avoiding unnecessary war at all costs should be your kind of first agenda. All throughout human history, the true victors of most conflicts are those who sit on the sidelines, or better yet, sell food, fuel, munitions, and weapons to both sides. I mean, take a look at India's recent meteoric economic rise. It's due to many different factors, of course. But one of the most important things that India has done in the last 50 years, aside from some, regional border skirmishes, is that it's stayed out of all major wars, all major economic wars. It's basically remained neutral. India is a non-aligned country, kind of like Mandalore, and has close ties to both the ghosts of the Soviet Union and the West. And whenever it's badgered by either side to join their coalition or sanctions, India will just point out that there is too much poverty in their country. And so no, they won't cut ties with countries that they depend on economically. Now, of course, as someone who's really passionate about the sovereignty of Ukraine, it can be frustrating when India sits out such conflicts. I would call it even borderline selfish, but then again, that's really not fair. I mean, if you've seen the horrific slums in Mumbai and Delhi where children and people live amongst garbage and feces, it's really hard to blame India for kind of watching out for its own people first. It's probably what the people demand. And so for the empire to base its entire political and economic system on militarization is truly a puzzling thing when so many nations try their hardest to sit out. And if you take a look at the Empire situation at the time, the Clone Wars had ended. I mean, there should have been a scaling back of military spending, if anything. Some clone troopers could have been retired. Other clones could have been enlisted in a civilian corps to, rebuild the galaxy, build new infrastructure. But no, instead the Empire, which already was heavily in debt due to the financial burden they carried over from the Republic period, decided to double down on military spending that it really had no business doing. Now, if Palpatine actually had an independent governor for its intergalactic bank or, a politically independent chairman for its version of the Federal Reserve, he probably would have gotten some good advice to, decrease military spending and focus more on rebuilding and servicing all that debt. But of course, Emperor Palpatine, as Chancellor of the Republic, had already taken over the IGBC. This was the biggest banking organization in the galaxy, and it backed the Galactic Credit. And so, Palpatine was able to now freely print as much Imperial credits as he wanted. Future be damned, modern monetary theory. Now, borrowing money in itself is not a problem as long as that money is spent on investment that can increase the size of the economy and tax revenue. That usually means borrowed money needs to be spent on, smart investments like infrastructure, social programs for the people, anti-dolphin education, or just, policies that make the free market more accessible for individuals, small businesses, the middle class. Notice how I don't mention military spending in this tiny little list. And that's because military spending is generally not seen as a traditionally smart investment in a lot of ways. Now, the great military works of Palpatine were so massive that at least initially there was an economic boom, especially in the core regions of the galaxy. You have the complete revitalization of the Federal District on Coruscant, including the creation of many new offices and departments for government jobs. I mean, for those of you who lived in DC post 9/11, you guys remember what happened, right? When the Bush administration greatly increased the size of the federal government and security agencies, there was a housing boom and entire neighborhoods would spring up overnight, making DC a lot more energetic and nicer place to live. It also increased rent significantly. Now, there is no inherent problem with spending money on government if it can benefit the people and encourage growth. Better yet, if you spend money on heavy industry, which is basically the base of a military-industrial complex, that can create even bigger gains in the future. The problem is what your government does with that military power that is being created. If you're fighting an existential war, like the Ukrainians are now, or like the Israelis did in 1948, then yes, spend as much money as possible in order to make sure your people don't get genocided and erased from history. And so the destruction that warfare does to your economy in those extreme cases is an acceptable loss. But when you're the Galactic Empire and you're presiding over the first period of peace in like 4 to 5 years, increasing your military budget makes absolutely zero sense. The reality is, other than some pockets of separatist hardliners in the western reaches and some other isolated pockets in the galaxy, the Empire really didn't need a larger military. I mean, it never even should have ventured into the Outer Rim with the intent of occupying territory. That was just stupid. And this is a military operation with no stated goals, no stated objectives that could lead to the end of the operation, and that generally is a red flag and can lead to forever war. Americans are intimately aware of this problem. If only all wars was let's go kill Hitler and then go home, but that's just not the case. And the Empire's conflict on the Outer Rim is just one of the worst examples of this type of forever war. There were some objectives like seizing resources on specific planets. Lothal had its massive dunium deposits. Mon Cala had its exotic underwater flora, deep-sea minerals, Mon Cala caviar, and Ender Moon, well, it had Ewok chiefs. But even the objectives of these missions were poorly thought out. And that's because instead of brokering a good deal with the locals in these areas to create long-term operations for resource extraction, the Galactic Empire just took whatever they wanted or created extremely unfair circumstances for the locals. And so to ensure the success of these operations, the Imperial military was actually called in to oppress the local population. And sometimes they even ran prison labor camps like the ones we saw on Ryloth. But it's also what happens when your military spending makes up the majority of your imperial budget. When you use so many credits scrapping the old navy, decommissioning the old ground army, and then replacing it with brand new shiny toys, if you aren't using those toys to great effect, then even in an authoritarian society, people will start to ask questions. Also, the millions upon millions of soldiers you're training and equipping are going to want to use that training. And perhaps the most dangerous part of a military-first economy is that if you stop building war machines, massive amounts of your population are going to be unemployed. And that makes your factory towns fertile places for rebel recruitment. I mean, just take a look at the world of Solist when the 61st Mobile Infantry, a rebel unit, attacked the planet. The Cobalt Labor Reformation Front also launched a simultaneous attack all across the planet in cities, and that's how the Empire lost the planet. And so oftentimes when diplomacy can lead to economic trees or political solutions, the Empire was forced instead to send Star Destroyers and squads of stormtroopers to solve these problems. Because that's how the political and economic system was set up in the Empire. They used the military before everything else, and that is such a stupid idea. And to make things worse, these Star Destroyers, these stormtroopers, which are basically the real world equivalent of, battleships and shock troopers, were not effective as peacekeeping and essentially police tools. I mean, these were weapons of destruction, and they were completely overkill, and oftentimes they created more problems than they solved. And so the Empire's military-first policy probably brought a few good years of economic growth, but it ultimately led to a forever war that destroyed everything. It's very likely if the Empire just consolidated at the peripherals of civilized space and left the Outer Rim in the same state that the Galactic Republic did, then the Empire would have never overstretched itself from a military standpoint, and more importantly, money could have been invested into actual industries that provide value and worth instead of destroying it, like the military-industrial complex. And if you have jobs, stability, and prices, your basic needs are taken care of, who is going to join the rebellion? Especially the early rebellion where your choices are Saw Gerrera's partisans or some other extremely ragged outfit full of crazies. I mean, rebellions typically don't work until the middle class decide they've had enough and actually join. I mean, you really have to screw up for Bob from accounting to strap a detonator on his vest and walk into your local Imperial Public Liaison office. I mean, as Americans, we typically look at rebellion very positively, but I mean, if you understand history, most rebellions are incredibly brutal and terrible, and sometimes when the rebels win, they become even worse than the government they try to overthrow, and that is the truth of rebellion. Rarely is it a good idea, unless you really have a solid plan. So oftentimes authoritarians like Palpatine make the mistake of taking on dissidents head-on through suppression, when the much easier and wiser move is to actually listen to the dissidents and identify if what they're talking about is actually a problem, and if that problem could be solved through simple policy decisions. When negotiations break down, when compromise is no longer an option, then warfare and violence erupts. Emperor Palpatine's madness ultimately turned the entire galaxy against him, one system at a time, especially after he started destroying entire planets with that super laser. What should have been a collection of simple local uprisings that could have been stamped down easily turned into a galactic network, a real rebellion. And once the Rebel Alliance was strong enough to basically permanently remain in the galaxy, well, all the Rebel Alliance really needed to do was to survive long enough for the rest of the galaxy to wake up to the reality that the Empire only had one tool in its kit box: a hammer.